How's it going, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Killmark Collectors. I'm Brandon, and today we're going to be continuing our series on fleet ops and the importance of SRP, that magical word that means that you get your ship back after it goes. We'll also be covering some of the basic commands and jargon that you can expect to hear, so let's get undocked and get started. Living in Null Sec, it's pretty much guaranteed that at some point you're going to be in a large fleet op and you're probably going to end up getting blown up. As much as I'd love to say it, you can't win them all. But if people were just losing ships left and right and they didn't have any way to get them back, the game would be pretty short-lived. Let's be honest, EVE is pretty harsh on players who lose ships. You can spend weeks or even months building up to something that can be gone in less than a minute. So with that being the case, a lot of alliances and corporations have what's called a ship replacement program, or SRP. Now, SRP is important because it allows pilots to go and fight in some of these engagements without the fear that they won't be able to field any other ships. Now, this obviously has a pretty big impact on an alliance's ability to wage war. So it's not something that most alliances will just throw out willy-nilly. For example, in our alliance, there are specific doctrine fits and ships that will be SRP'd. Now, for many people starting out, this may be an SFI, moving into a Naga, or eventually when we hit T9, something else. So why don't people just want you to bring the most powerful ship that you possibly can? Well, there's two reasons for that. The first is that as a fleet commander, if you know exactly what is going to be in your fleet, you can plan your tactics accordingly. If you're a fleet commander planning an operation, knowing which types of ships you're going to be using is going to be critical. You'll be able to plan the engagement to engage it at a specific range, warp in from specific areas, and really just have a better idea of how to control the fleet and how to engage with the enemy. Now, the other side of this is also availability. A lot of times it's difficult to get more nuanced or less popular ships that people might fly, and so being able to replace those hulls is a lot easier if you know kind of generally what people are flying and you can quickly get those ships back into the pilot's hands. Almost more of a morale thing at that point. When the Alliance calls for a fleet op, a lot of times they'll announce specific fits. For most of our engagements, it is going to be a strike fit, but it could be a brawler or even something more weird and crazy. I, for one, am a big fan of the E-Warp, but, that's just me. As you can start going through and figuring out what those fits are, you can stock modules and you can have a better understanding of what the fleets are going to need so that, again, you can be better prepared when the time comes. All right, so that's SRP. Let's assume for a minute that we're not going to get blown up and we're actually going to engage in a fleet op. There's a couple of different terms that I want to make sure that you're familiar with before you get into a fleet op. And of course, I'm going to break these down because that's what I do. I like lists. So the first kind of category or list that we're going to have is going to be travel commands. Obviously, as you start moving forward, things may devolve as you meet the enemy, but in order to get there, there will be a couple of commands so that you move as a fleet and you don't get split up and somebody ends up getting blapped. First off, undock. Really the key thing here, especially if you have people outside of the station, you do want to listen for that undock command. The last thing you want is for somebody to undock, make a mistake, and lose that ship right in the middle of when you're going to need them. So then once we actually start getting to traveling, there are a couple of commands that you need to be listening out for. The first is going to be the approach command. This seems kind of counterintuitive because I should just be able to hit warp or whatever. But what hitting approach to a faraway gate does is it aligns your ship so that you're ready to warp when the moment comes. Now, this is really important when we start talking about using battleships and larger, slower ships in these types of fleet ops. Those ships can take up to 20 seconds to fully align to the gate that they're going to be flying to. And so if you have a smaller ship that maybe only has a 5-second align time, there's a good 15 seconds there where an enemy could pop a bubble or do something else that could disrupt the formation of the fleet. One thing to note here is that it is important to understand how warping works. you need to first jump in. Let's say that you're jumping into a gate. The fleet itself is all going to be pointing in different directions, and so it may not be immediately clear on where people are aligned to. When your fleet commander gives that align command, all of those ships go into the correct position, and then they will start accelerating towards that gate. The way that warping works is that once you're aligned, you have to hit 75% of your max current speed in order to be able to warp. What this means is that if you have your thrusters on 100% and you're already starting to warp, when you finally do hit that warp command, it should be near instantaneous. If you remember when I was saying that those bigger battleships have up to a 20-second time between when you hit warp and you actually start, this is what cuts that down. So instead of having a huge 15-second gap, it should be almost instantaneous. And really only the difference should be between when you have the pilot actually hitting the warp buttons. Now, that brings us to the next point, which is warp versus jump. When you hear the command to warp, the idea is that you're going to be warping to that gate and you're going to be sitting there in the same system that you're currently in. As opposed to jump, which means, or jump on contact, which means you're going to warp to that gate and you're immediately going to jump through it. By default, you should always be holding your cloak so that if there is somebody on the other side, you can give everybody some time to get into the gate and then give the fleet commanders kind of a quick sense of what's going on and let them quickly decide on tactics and issue commands. The other thing that you want to make sure of here is when you do hear warp versus jump, it's really important that you do follow that command exactly. Don't try to go and scout ahead if you're not a scout. The reason here again is because if you go and jump on your own, the entire fleet is not going to be there with you if there's a gate camp on the other side. Or if you jump in and you're trying to hunt specific targets and there's a huge local spike, that might scare those targets and they may go ahead and dock up. Either way, just be listening for those specific commands. Now, when you are scouting, this is a little bit different, and I'm going to talk about this in the fourth episode when we talk about smaller ships and scouting and some of the other functions that they can provide. One thing to note here, though, is that if you do hear a +1 or a -1, what that is saying is one jump ahead of the main fleet or one jump behind the main fleet. In most cases, and you're flying a normal cruiser, this is not going to matter, but just so that you are aware, when you hear that, if somebody says that they're reporting in from the +1 or the -1, that's what's going to be giving you an idea of what's going on. So now we've actually gotten to our objective. There's a couple of other commands that you need to be listening out for, and that you'll probably hear in fairly short order. The first is going to be to anchor up, and this is basically just get inside the bubble. Manually approach. You may have fleet commands that are issued. Make sure that you go ahead and take those and then follow that up by manually approaching. You will also probably hear something along the lines of broadcast for reps. This just means that if you're getting in trouble, you want to broadcast to your fleet to make sure that you are actually getting targeted by the size or whatever other Logi pilots you have. As a result of the 50-man fleets that were just released, you do need to make sure that you actually go into your settings in the fleet itself and you look for the commands from everyone or the broadcasts from everyone. And the reason for this is that the way that the new fleets are divvied up, depending on your role in the fleet, you may or may not actually get that command. So especially for Logi pilots, make sure that you're actually changing that setting in the fleet options so that you're seeing that, and if somebody does need reps or they call for reps, you're able to get that command. Other commands that might be a little bit less nuanced, at some point you may hear drop a can. That just means to jettison something in your cargo. If you have plasmoids or other fuel, you can just split one and then just go ahead and jettison that. What this does is it gives your fleet a warp point. You've got multiple people in the fleet and you're trying to consolidate. Man, this is thirsty work. All right, so if you drop a can, what that allows you to do is it allows friendlies to go ahead and warp to that box. That can help consolidate your fleet and make sure that everybody is able to get back together, whether it's due to disconnects or anything like that. So that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for joining me. For homework, what I want you to do is I want you to just listen in, be a bit of a creep here. When you see a fleet op coming in, go ahead and join up on voice comms and just listen to the types of commands and what's being talked about back and forth. This will help give you an idea of kind of the way and the situation that commands are issued, and will help you be better prepared to respond in the event that you actually are able to get into a fleet as a pilot, not just a weird creepy stalker that's listening in on voice comms. Once again, thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate your support. So reach down, hit that subscribe button, ding the little bell. It'll notify you when the next video, which happens to be actually getting out and starting to fly, will be dropping, so that you can be even more prepared when it is time for you to jump into the action. So until then, thanks so much for joining me. Have a great week and fly safe.